There is a moment, and you have had it, even if you've buried it under everything else, when the noise stops. Not the noise outside, the noise inside. The perpetual, low-grade static of your own avoidance. And in that moment, for just a second before you reach for your phone, or turn on the television, or call someone you don't particularly want to talk to, you catch a glimpse of something that lives beneath all the performance. Something that doesn't have a name yet, because you've never let it stay long enough to introduce itself. That thing is you. The real version. Not the one who shows up to meetings and makes the right jokes and knows when to laugh. The one who exists in the negative space between all your noise. And most of us will spend our entire lives making sure we never have to meet it. This is not about meditation. This is not about mindfulness retreats or digital detoxes or the kind of silence that gets marketed to you as a productivity hack. This is about something far more terrifying, the diagnostic function of quiet. The way silence, real silence, operates like an MRI on your interior life, revealing every calcification of regret, every hairline fracture of unlived desire, every mass of meaning you have chosen to leave unexamined. Silence does not heal you. It does not soothe you. First, it indicts you, and most people cannot tolerate the indictment, so they never get to whatever comes after. I know a woman named Clara who worked as a senior art director at a mid-size advertising firm in Manchester for 9 years. She was extraordinary at her job, visually rigorous, collaborative, ferociously talented. She had a flat she decorated with the precision of someone who understood beauty at a cellular level. She had a partner she respected. She hosted dinner parties where people left genuinely nourished, not just full. From the outside, Clara's life was a proof of concept for a certain kind of modern flourishing. She told me once, over the kind of wine that gets opened at 1 a.m. when honesty becomes unavoidable, that she had not spent more than 6 consecutive minutes in complete silence in 4 years. She had timed it, not because she was monitoring herself, but because 4 years ago she had tried, really tried, to sit in her flat on a Sunday morning with no music, no podcast, no background television. She'd lasted 6 minutes before something rose in her chest like floodwater, and she'd grabbed her phone with the urgency of someone reaching for a lifebuoy. She said it felt like grief. She didn't know what she was grieving. That was the worst part. The grief had no object. It was just grief, sourceless and total, waiting in the silence as it had always been there, like it had been there before she'd ever begun making noise to cover it. She's still at the advertising firm, not because she loves it. She stays because leaving would require her to know what she wants, and knowing what she wants requires a quality of interior listening she has never been willing to risk. The silence is where that answer lives, and so she keeps the noise running. This is not unusual. Behaviorally, what Clara is doing has a precise name: experiential avoidance. It is one of the most extensively documented patterns in clinical psychology, the human tendency to suppress, escape, or avoid internal experiences, particularly uncomfortable ones. The psychologist Stephen Hayes, who developed acceptance and commitment therapy, identified experiential avoidance not as a pathology exactly, but as the central machinery of psychological suffering. The more aggressively a person avoids an internal state, the more psychologically rigid they become. Their world shrinks. Their choices narrow. They mistake the absence of discomfort for the presence of well-being, when actually they have simply become extraordinarily skilled at maintaining a particular kind of numbness. The silence terrifies because the silence is where the avoided experience lives. Every moment of quiet is a potential ambush. The noise is not a pleasure, it is a perimeter defense. But here is where it gets stranger, more specific, and more unforgiving. Experiential avoidance is not one size fits all. What lives in your particular silence is not what lives in Clara's. The content is uniquely yours. That specificity is what makes silence genuinely diagnostic, rather than merely uncomfortable. It functions as a mirror that cannot lie by omission. In the absence of distraction, what surfaces first is always the thing you have most consistently refused to address. Not a random assortment of your unfinished business, but the most urgent item, the one your psyche has been trying to show you in the margins of your distracted life. In idle moments at traffic lights, in the 3 seconds before a podcast resumes, in the gap between putting down your phone and falling asleep. The content of those microseconds is the same every time. It is the same thought, the same image, the same half-formed sentence, and you know what it is. You know right now, reading this, you've been sliding past it for months, maybe years, clicking away from it the way you click past an uncomfortable ad. But it is the most important thing about your current life. It is the thing your silence is trying to say. My friend Rahul, a cardiologist, not a metaphor, an actual doctor who spends his days saving the lives of people experiencing precisely the kind of rupture his own life has been quietly building toward, has not slept without a white noise machine since 2019. He can tell you the exact moment he started. He was in his car after a late shift, and in the parking garage's concrete silence, the thought came, I have made myself into a person my younger self would not recognize, and I am not sure he would like me. It was not a thought he could work with. It was not actionable, not clinical, not solvable with a protocol. It was simply true, and its truth was devastating. The white noise machine was in his Amazon cart by the time he reached his front door. He is not unaware of the irony. He knows what he's doing. He is brilliant enough to understand his own avoidance with perfect clarity and still choose it, every night, because the alternative is lying in the dark with a version of himself he has not yet found the courage to confront or forgive. This is the thing that rarely gets named directly. Knowing is not enough. Self-awareness itself becomes another layer of noise. Rahul knows. Clara knows. Knowing functions as a substitute for action, a way of maintaining the fiction of engagement with one's own life while doing nothing. You can be fully conscious of your avoidance and still choose it. You can narrate your own paralysis in real time with impressive psychological vocabulary and still not move. Insight without intervention is just a more sophisticated form of the same stasis. Someone is reading this right now, and I mean this specifically, not rhetorically, who has spent so long narrating their own stuckness that the narration has become a form of identity. The story of the person who knows they're avoiding their calling, their grief, their necessary ending, that story has become load-bearing. It holds up the architecture of who you understand yourself to be. To stop avoiding would require not just action, but the relinquishment of a whole identity. The tortured intellectual who understands their own paralysis. The sensitive soul too complex for simple answers. The person is perpetually on the verge of transformation. These are comfortable characters to inhabit. The silence strips them away. In the silence, there is no character, no narrative, no flattering self-image. There is only what you have done and what you have not done, and the gap between who you are and who you might have been. Here, I want to name a counter-argument directly, because it deserves more than a dismissal. There is a legitimate case to be made that the kind of interiority I'm describing is a luxury, and that the expectation of meaningful self-confrontation through silence is an artifact of privilege, available to those whose basic material needs are met, whose lives permit the indulgence of existential inventory. There are people for whom the noise is survival, not evasion, whose constant motion and distraction is not avoidance of the self, but the necessary management of a life whose demands are relentless, and whose silence genuinely offers nothing but the cold arithmetic of scarcity. That case is not wrong. Viktor Frankl, writing from the interior of Auschwitz, and I use that example not for dramatic effect, but because Frankl's observations were made under the most extreme conditions of dehumanization imaginable, noted that even amid total external horror, humans retained what he called the last of the human freedoms, the ability to choose one's response to one's circumstances, and to find meaning even in suffering. But he was also clear that this freedom was not equally accessible to everyone, and that exhaustion, starvation, and terror eroded the capacity for the kind of interior work he described. So yes, the counter-argument has weight. For some people, the noise is unavoidable. It is endurance. But, and this is the reframing rather than the dismissal, for most of the people who will encounter these words, that is not the situation. The honest accounting of your distraction, if you were willing to do it, would not reveal a person managing a genuine crisis. It would reveal a person who is comfortable enough to choose and who is choosing noise, not because they must, but because they can, because the noise is available, cheap and effective, and because the culture has organized itself around the efficient provision of distraction at every scale. Because silence has become the genuinely subversive act, not in a romanticized, spiritual practice way, but in the specific, threatening sense that it removes the infrastructure of self-evasion at a moment when every commercial and algorithmic force in your environment is invested in your continued evasion. Your attention is the product. Your distraction is the commodity. Every platform you use is architecturally designed to ensure you never sit alone with yourself long enough to ask the questions that would make you less useful as a consumer. The noise is not accidental. It is engineered. And inside that engineered noise, the real you is slowly becoming a stranger you meet less and less frequently, until one day you realize you've lost the ability to find each other at all. I want to tell you about a man named David who chose silence and, by the world's measure, lost everything. I want you to hold that story because it is the most important one I can offer you. David was a 43-year-old partner at a law firm in Chicago. Litigation, successful by every metric that a certain kind of life uses to keep score. Over the course of 15 years, he had slowly replaced himself with his career, not because he was weak or unconscious, but because he was good at the work and the work rewarded goodness with more work. Somewhere in that cycle, the person who had once written short stories in college and spent his 20s burning with opinions about literature, love, and justice had been replaced by someone who was very effective at depositions and very frightened of the quiet. When his marriage ended, not dramatically, not with infidelity or crisis, but with the slow, dignified exhaustion of two people who had not spoken honestly in years, David did something that terrified everyone who loved him. He stopped. He took a leave of absence. He went to a rented house on Lake Michigan in November, which is no one's idea of a beautiful time to be at a lake, and he sat in the silence, not retreating, not meditating, just sitting. He later described the first week as something close to detox. The anxiety was physical, chest tight, hands restless, mind producing an endless torrent of work thoughts, procedural memories, briefs to file, calls to make, the urgent noise of a life organized around productivity suddenly deprived of its raw material. He couldn't read. He couldn't write. He could barely eat. He sat in the silence, and the silence was brutal, and the grief was enormous, and he had no idea what he was grieving except everything, except the 15 years, except the self that had been slowly vacated. He did not return to the firm. He lost the partnership. He spent 2 years writing a novel no one published. He moved to a smaller city, a smaller life, an income his former colleagues would find embarrassing. He is not happy in the way happiness is sold. He is not peaceful or enlightened or particularly serene. But when I spoke with him recently, he said something I have not stopped thinking about. He said, "I finally live in a life that is mine. Not the one I built to avoid myself. The one I actually wanted. I don't know if it's better, but it's honest, and I've stopped being afraid of what I'll find in the quiet, because now when I sit in it, what comes up is just my life, not evidence of the life I refused, just mine." That failure, the lost partnership, the unpublished novel, the reduced circumstances, is not a cautionary tale. It is what it looks like when someone chooses the truth, pays the social cost, and survives. The world did not reward David's honesty. It never does. Not immediately, not in the currencies we've been taught to value. The silence asked him a question, and he answered it. Answering cost him the scaffolding of a life he'd built to avoid answering. That is not a tragedy. That is, by any philosophically rigorous accounting, a kind of freedom that most people, including most people who believe they value freedom, will never choose. The philosopher Blaise Pascal wrote in the 17th century that all of humanity's problems stem from the inability to sit quietly in a room alone. It is one of those sentences that has been quoted so often it has acquired the gloss of an aphorism, something you nod at and move on from, something that lives on motivational posters and loses its violence in the process. But strip away the familiarity and feel what Pascal was actually saying. Not that humans are bad at being calm, not that modern life is too busy. That's all of the problems, the wars, the cruelties, the structures of oppression, and the small devastations of ordinary life. the betrayals, and the cowardices and the violence. All of it flows from the inability to sit alone in silence. He was saying that every harm humans have inflicted on each other has at its root a person who could not bear to be alone with what they found inside themselves, and so turned outward, toward conquest, toward consumption, toward noise, toward the aggressive reorganization of the external world as a strategy for not reorganizing the interior one. The silence is not just a personal diagnosis, it is a civilizational one. Kierkegaard, who understood dread more precisely than almost anyone who has put words to it, named what lives in the silence as anxiety, not anxiety in the clinical, contemporary sense, but anxiety as the dizziness of freedom, the vertigo that arises when you are confronted not with what you have done wrong, but with the infinite number of things you could still do. The silence is not dread because it shows you your failures. It is dread because it shows you your possibilities. And possibilities are terrifying because they require choice, and choice requires relinquishing every other possibility. Most of us would rather keep all possible versions of our lives in a permanent, unactualized, suspended state than commit to one and lose the rest. The noise keeps all possibilities alive. The silence demands you choose. There is a physical reality to what happens when you actually stop. When you sit with the silence long enough for the first wave of anxiety to pass, something shifts in the nervous system. Research on default mode network activation, the brain's resting state, shows that what we experience as boredom or discomfort in the absence of stimulation is actually the brain shifting into a mode of deep integration, making connections between disparate memories and experiences, processing emotional residue, and consolidating identity. What you feel as agitation in the first 15 minutes of silence is your brain coming off stimulation addiction. What happens in the 20 minutes after that, if you can tolerate the agitation, is something neurologically closer to sleep's deepest work. You are not doing nothing. You are doing the most important cognitive work a human nervous system performs. You are becoming coherent. The fragmented, context-switching, perpetually reactive consciousness that characterizes a distracted life is actually a form of neural incoherence. Silence is not emptiness. It is integration. But it feels like drowning before it feels like breathing. And here is the unglamorous truth of what change actually looks like in this context, because I refuse to leave this at the level of inspiration without honoring how ugly the process is. It is not the first time you sit in silence and have a breakthrough. It is the 47th time you sit in silence and mostly feel restless and stupid and convinced this is a waste of time. It is the act of returning to the quiet after you've fled it 17 times in 1 week. It is the specific humiliation of catching yourself reaching for your phone to fill a 30-second gap, choosing not to, and then feeling those 30 seconds of nothing like a small eternity. The practice of silence is not a transcendent experience. It is the slow, inglorious work of building a tolerance for your own interior. Like physical therapy, tedious, incremental, frequently painful, rarely cinematic. The moment of revelation, if it comes, is not the point. The point is the daily choosing of honest discomfort over comfortable dishonesty. The woman who chose this and lost everything I mentioned earlier was not David. It was a poet named Sarah who had spent 12 years as an educational consultant in London, a job she was good at but that meant nothing to her, a job that kept her near education without requiring her to engage with the thing she actually loved, which was language. She published one pamphlet of poetry in 2018 to a silence so complete it was almost comedic. 14 readers, if you count the poet herself. She kept her consulting job. She had a mortgage. She had a child. She had every practical reason to keep the noise going. But she began getting up at 5 in the morning and sitting in silence before the rest of her life turned on, and in that silence she wrote poems. Not the career pivot poems, not the Instagram poems, not the poems that might build an audience. The poems that the silence produced, strange and difficult, and, she knew, unlikely to be widely loved. She published a collection 2 years ago that was shortlisted for 1 prize and largely ignored. She didn't leave the consulting job. She still hasn't. But she told me that the poems changed something structural, that the life is now divided differently, that there is a part of her life that is genuinely hers, and the rest, the noise, the career, the mortgage, is just maintenance, and the maintenance no longer feels like imprisonment because it is no longer the totality. That is not a transformation. That is not a revolution. It is the small, specific act of refusing to let the noise win completely, of carving out, in the silence, a territory that cannot be colonized by distraction or performance or the ambient pressure to produce a life that photographs well. Here is what the data says, because I promised you a diagnosis rather than a sermon, and diagnoses require honesty about prognosis. The psychological literature on behavior change consistently shows that between 5 and 8% of people who genuinely understand a behavior they need to change actually change it. 5 to 8%. Not because the other 92 to 95% lack intelligence, willpower, or sincerity, because change requires the consistent tolerance of discomfort in the absence of immediate reward, and the human nervous system is magnificently, evolutionarily optimized to avoid exactly that. The people who read something like this feel genuinely moved, and then return to exactly the life they were living. They are not moral failures. They are statistical majorities. The insight will fade. The discomfort of the silence will reassert itself. The phone will be there, warm and immediate, endlessly generous with its small dopaminergic rewards. And the life that is genuinely theirs will remain in the quiet, waiting patient as a held breath. The counterforce to that statistical reality is not willpower. It is not motivation, which is a feeling and therefore unreliable. It is the cold, uncomfortable decision to stay in the silence anyway, not because you feel like it, not because you've had a breakthrough, but because you have decided, with full knowledge of how hard it is, that you will not spend your entire life making noise to avoid yourself. That decision, made in the dark, without applause, without the guarantee of any particular outcome, is the only version of courage that actually exists. Everything else is just the performance of courage, which is its own form of noise. What lives in your silence is not a monster. It is not punishment. In most cases, it is not even that dramatic. Most of what lives in the silence is unfinished. The conversation you've been avoiding, the work you've been circling without committing to, the relationship whose character you know and whose ending you're postponing. The version of yourself that existed before you became very good at being what other people needed you to be. These things are not catastrophic. They are just true. And the truth, in the silence, is the one thing you cannot edit, curate, or reframe. It simply is. You can spend a whole life keeping it at bay, filling every gap with noise, managing the distance between yourself and yourself with extraordinary skill and dedication. People do it. Many people do it. Most people do it. They arrive at the end of their lives having successfully avoided the interior confrontation that the silence demands, surrounded by people who love the person they performed, and they are very, very tired. Or you can sit in it, not because it will definitely lead somewhere, not because the silence holds answers to every question, but because the alternative, a life assembled entirely from avoidance, built noise by noise over decades into something that looks like a life from the outside, but is hollow at the center, is the only genuine tragedy available to a human being who was given the gift of consciousness and chose not to use it on themselves. You know what lives in your silence. You have always known. The only question left is whether you are willing to stay in the room long enough to say hello.